Good morning. This is the Contreras Report for the week of November 15th, 2021. I am Raul Lowry Contreras, your correspondent. The first subject we are talking about this morning is the absolute embarrassment the historically fabulous Republican Party has become under the leadership of Donald J. Trump. He and his cohort of people and what they believe are at best stupid politically, bordering on mental deficiency, mental illness. Secondly, we'll talk with the Washington Post writers group Ruben Navarrete about the federal indictment of Trump choirmaster Steve Bannon, former advisor and campaign manager of Donald J. Trump. He was indicted by a federal grand jury on 2 charges relating to his ignoring subpoenas from Congress. His claim he doesn't have to testify about what part he had in the January 6th mob attack on Congress. His claim is that he is protected and covered by executive privilege manifested by former President Trump. Of course, he's not. He wasn't in the government in January 2021. Therefore, he's not covered by executive privilege, even if it was legal and existed on that day. Then we'll wind up with some talk about the border reopening with Mexico and how the border government employees bungled the reopening and what can be done to improve border security and daily management while we are in fact fighting off the incompetence on the border by federal workers, officers that are incompetent and blind to how to manage the border. Let's start. What claims to be the Republican Party today is a gutless, spineless shadow of the Republicans who rallied for victory 2 years after Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater was creamed, was inundated, was flooded by the penultimate corrupt Democrat since racist Woodrow Wilson. Lyndon Baines Johnson was his name. I should know. Election night 1966 found me in a traveling party bus going between Republican candidate campaign offices, pouring California champagne to celebrate the great Republican victory of 1966. We celebrated winning state legislators like newcomer and future California governor and U.S. Senator Pete Wilson, 2 congressmen and gubernatorial candidates in Michigan and Maryland named George Romney and Spiro Agnew. There also was an extra bottle of champagne to celebrate the election of jovial B-movie actor Ronald Reagan, governor of California. Though not on any ballot that year, former Vice President Richard Nixon, loser of the 1960 presidential election, was in 1966 a definite winner. He campaigned all over the country for Republican candidates for all federal and state offices. So many won, an instant national army was created that owed much to Richard Nixon, who was in the middle of a forthcoming 1968 presidential election. Nixon knew the American people were unhappy about the raging war in Vietnam, and that somehow he could use that as an issue to run for president in 1968. When he did run, he announced that he had a plan to end the war. He never detailed his plan, but his ordering troops home on the day he was inaugurated on January 20th, 1969 was a really good indication he planned to end the war. He planned to end John F. Kennedy's war when he became president, and he did. We Republicans had no idea Lyndon Johnson would not run for re-election or that Richard Nixon would benefit immensely by Johnson being run out of office by opponents in his own party, especially a senator named Eugene McCarthy. The name McCarthy is important to this essay because it was Wisconsin Senator Eugene McCarthy that stood up to an incumbent president and chased the president out of office. A previous senator from Wisconsin, Republican Joe McCarthy, had crawled out from an alcoholic cloud to historically set new records of sleaze. His allegation that the State Department was full of Moscow-led communist traitors to America was made in 1949, and despite his announcement that he had a list of the traitors, we never saw the list. I don't know how to explain that so many years after that happened in the late 40s and early 50s. But I want you to know that those of you who weren't alive then, those were really tough years because Joe McCarthy had a following, just like Trump, and they really caused a lot of friction. Now, communists were looked at very badly in those years, and there were investigations at the House and the Senate about these people and trying to find out who they were, and they found some. And they took away top secret clearances, and they had people fired. But there was an emotional drive behind this campaign that was not good for the country, as it turns out. But Joe McCarthy had his usefulness as a senator for some part of his Senate career, but he harmed America. McCarthyism still rings negatively in my head. Now, the opposite of the main opponents to the Vietnam War, Eugene McCarthy, was just the opposite of the main opposition to the Vietnam War. That was consisted mostly of bearded hippie men with long hair protesting their being called up by a decades-long conscription, a draft, like their fathers had in World War II. Eugene McCarthy took on his political party, his president, and won a lot of votes. He ran against an incumbent president. He ran an incumbent president out of office. Eugene McCarthy was a brave man. That in contrast to another senator from Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy, which I have just discussed. Joe McCarthy was a loser and led a ragtag following around the country that believed in him, and he lied through his teeth so many times and so negatively influenced a portion of his Republican Party that the Republican president of the United States had to reject Joe McCarthy. He slapped him around. Why? Because in 1949, Joe pulled a piece of paper out of his suit pocket at his speech in West Virginia and he waved that paper around and claimed he had a list of 211 communists working in the State Department. In other times it was 300, and other times it was 100, and so he never really settled on a number. But he never revealed those names that he claimed by name, that he had by name. There was no list. He made it up. He lied. President Dwight Eisenhower criticized McCarthy publicly. The U.S. Senate censured him. And so it goes. A year later or so, he died. During the 1949 to 1969 20 years, one good McCarthy and one bad McCarthy. Fast forward to today. Add another bad McCarthy, Kevin McCarthy, Republican congressman from Bakersfield, California, and elected minority leader of the House of Representatives. He has crawled out from his cave to embarrass real Republicans and real Americans. On January 6, 2021, he was a national hero for many for assigning guilt and responsibility to then President Trump for the massive invasion of the Capitol of the United States by a ragtag group of Trump supporters. Within days, however, he flip-flopped into a butt-kissing gopher for the now former president, the man who lost the presidency in a great landslide, but lies every time he says a word about the election. He now resembles his Wisconsin Senator Joe, Tail Gunner Joe McCarthy, predecessor. Tail Gunner Joe flew one flight on a Marine airplane during World War II, and though he was an officer, he never flew again. The resemblance? Kevin is a gutless liar like Joe McCarthy. Where is the Kevin McCarthy that blamed Trump for the January 6th mob? Worse, he now has another embarrassment to the party to deal with, and he's doing nothing about it. From the Daily Beast, one of McCarthy's most extreme members, Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona, tweeted out a cartoon depicting him murdering Representative Alejandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Democrat of New York, and attacking President Joe Biden with swords. It prompted Democratic outrage and calls for McCarthy to respond. McCarthy hasn't said a word as of this moment. Rather, the GOP leader does face pressure within House Republicans to respond to two other events, to rebuke 13 Republicans who voted to fund roads and bridges, and to the lawmaker who publicly fantasized about chopping a colleague's head off. In the minds of some of the most pro-Trump Republicans, handling Democrats, that win amounts to treachery, the infrastructure bill passing. Many Republicans called any who voted for that as being traitors. Far more than anything Gosar did that's important to him. A group of them is preparing an internal GOP conference resolution to remove these Republicans from their committee assignments for voting for a bill to build roads and bridges. There are questions from both sides of the aisle about what leaders plan to do about Paul Gosar. As one senior GOP aide told the Daily Beast, quote, "We would be freaking out if the roles were reversed," unquote. McCarthy will probably do nothing, yet again putting Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat of California, in the position of weighing whether to issue a partisan rebuke of an opposition member who the GOP decided to protect. In February, Democrats moved to boot Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, idiot Republican from Georgia, off her committees after a string of controversial episodes in which she, among other things, yelled at congressmen outside of the Capitol. House Republicans are emblematic of their forces McCarthy will have to manage if he takes the majority in 2022 in the 2022 midterms. He is tasked with leading two wings of the party that don't seem to follow his orders. If he moves to rein one in, he risks upsetting a delicate balance. McCarthy also risks upsetting the person whose support he needs to become Speaker of the House, Donald J. Trump. Trump is egging on the internal effort to punish the 13 Republicans. At a fundraiser for House Republicans' campaign arm on Tuesday night, he chastised the group for giving a win to Biden. One of them, Representative Nicole Maliotakis, Republican of New York, was in the audience. Part of the problem for McCarthy is he set expectations too high. It is said that McCarthy repeatedly told GOP members during private meetings that he had informed Democratic leaders they would have to put up the 218 votes needed to pass the infrastructure bill on their own before any Republicans supported it. That didn't happen. The fact is, only 215 Democrats voted for the infrastructure bill. It took 218 votes to pass. 13 Republicans voted for the bill. The bill passed because 13 Republicans voted for it, period. Without at least 3 of these Republicans voting for the bill would have failed. But is that a reason to punish these Republicans? And so now McCarthy has a faction of rabid Republicans who want to punish their colleagues because they voted for a bill that the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, and 18 other Senate Republicans supported. They voted yes. This all while the GOP conference gives Gosar a pass. One of the first acts McCarthy took when he became the House GOP leader in 2019 was to remove the longtime House GOP problem child, former Representative Stephen King, Republican of Iowa, from his committees. It wasn't one remark from King that did it. Rather, it was years of accumulated offenses that McCarthy said call into question whether he will treat all Americans equally without regard for race and ethnicity, quote unquote. King was bounced for the simple reason that the man is a through and through racist jerk that talked publicly about his racism. He made disparaging comments about any black or brown person or group that he could think of for years. The same could be said of Gosar, who has been the ultra-right pimple of the House of GOP for years now. pioneering a far-right posture on Capitol Hill before figures like Republican Representatives Green, Lauren Boebert of Colorado, and Matt Gaetz of Florida, who's facing his own federal investigation right now for sex with underage minors and sex trafficking. Every time, before they showed up, Gosar was, for example, associated with the far-right activist Nick Fuentes, whom the Justice Department has labeled a, quote, white supremacist, and spoke to a white nationalist conference where he was given a hero's welcome. He has called the deadly 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, a false flag set up by the left, attending meetings of right-wing militia groups, and was one of the first GOP lawmakers to downplay, even legitimize, the pro-Trump mob that stormed the Capitol on January 6. GOP leaders have ignored almost all of this behavior. Multiple sources have told the Daily Beast that Gosar's chief of staff, Thomas Van Flein, is the main source of the congressman's most toxic and terminally online social media content. A lawyer by training, imagine that. Van Flein has been with Gosar since he was sworn into office in 2011, serving as his chief of staff and lead counsel almost the entire time. The Alaska native's close ties with Sarah Palin brought him into Gosar's orbit. Van Flein served as the former Alaska governor's attorney and represented her in the so-called Troopergate scandal. He also did legal work for Rob Robinson, the Alaskan dentist who ran Gosar's 2010 campaign and introduced the candidate to Palin. During a crowded, competitive GOP primary for the seat, which unfolded at the height of the Tea Party movement, this unlikely contingent of Alaskan Gosar supporters helped deliver Palin's endorsement, which was crucial to Gosar's victory in Arizona. I don't know, you connect the dots. Through the last decade, Gosar has, quote, always been kind of crazy, and his office often, quote, a dumpster fire, said a former aide to the congressman, who recalled that Gosar and Van Flein often egged each other on in terms of how outrageous their messaging could be. McCarthy's dilemma, McCarthy now faces, is a tough decision. On his right, he has members calling for retribution for the Republicans who handed Democrats a win. Trump, whose favor McCarthy desperately needs, is out for vengeance too. But McCarthy also has centrist Republicans who are disgusted by Gosar's video and his long-running list of offenses and want McCarthy to do something now. Not to mention the fact that Democrats might actually act as they did to Green. All Democrats could simply vote to kick Gosar out of his committee assignments like they did the sweetheart, wicked witch of Georgia. Besides that, they could actually expel him from Congress. They don't need a two-thirds majority. All they need is 218 votes. Nearly 30 Democratic lawmakers have announced they would introduce a resolution to censure Gosar during the next House session. Quote, as the events of January 6th have shown, such vicious and vulgar messaging can and does foment actual violence, said the lawmakers led by Representatives, Ayanna Pressley, Democrat of Massachusetts, and Jackie Speer, Democrat of California, adding that Gosar's actions amounted to a clear-cut case for censure. Minority Leader McCarthy's silence is tacit approval and just as dangerous, they said. Many Democrats would prefer to keep pressure on McCarthy to act, but some privately say that there would be plenty of support for censoring Gosar if he does nothing. Pelosi's office pointed to the Daily Beast to a recent statement from the Speaker in which she called for probes into Gosar by the House Ethics Committee and by law enforcement. A senior GOP aide described the dilemma this way. If Democrats force a vote on censuring Gosar or removing him from his committee assignments, McCarthy will have to decide if he wants to allow a vote that would connect every Republican and the GOP brand to far-right gadflies, or if he'll throw him, Gosar, to the wolves of the Democratic caucus. The latter outcome could embolden calls from the far right to punish the 13 Republicans who voted for infrastructure as a sort of tit for tat. McCarthy likely doesn't want to remove those 13 Republicans from committees. Some of them are the most vulnerable in the GOP conference in the November election of next year, and he would be hard-pressed to build a majority in 2022 without them. Within many House GOP circles, few expect that any of these lawmakers are at risk of facing any form of rebuke at the hands of their colleagues, and several sources downplayed the seriousness of the push. The potential targets also dismissed it. This is a small group of members who are making loud noises, Representative Don Bacon, Republican of Nebraska, says. There is a real frustration within the GOP ranks over the yes votes. However, and a sentiment of the 13 lawmakers gave Biden a win when they could have easily handed him an embarrassing loss. Still, according to another senior House Republican aide, the episode is not worth dwelling on and risking narratives of the GOP dysfunction. Quote, they took a stupid vote and bailed out the speaker, the aide said of the 13. But to say they saved Nancy Pelosi's majority is a joke. But McCarthy may have trouble ignoring the calls for blood, especially when Republicans know that Democrats can force their hand on Gosar by moving a censure resolution or legislation to strip him of committees to the House floor. At the beginning of the year, when Green faced similar punishments in the GOP conference, McCarthy tried to appease everyone by defending Green while also defending then number 3 Republican Liz Cheney, Republican of Wyoming, who had just voted to impeach Trump. That gambit worked for a bit until Cheney kept disparaging Trump. If past this prologue, McCarthy will delay any decision as much as possible until enough Republican members, or Trump himself, force him to act. In any event, there is probably one winner in McCarthy's lose-loss situation, Gosar. And it's likely that the same will be said of any of the MAGA champions whose antics force a similar situation going forward. Kevin McCarthy is a gutless wonder. He must wonder is he even a real Republican, a real American? A real American would grab Congressman Gosar by his private parts and shake Gosar's stupidity out of him. He would then move to take away his committee assignments. If Gosar said one public word challenging McCarthy, McCarthy should introduce a bill to expel Gosar from Congress. A real man, a real American would do that. Let's take a break. We'll be right back.